You're watching Breakfast on Sky News. We'll have the news review in a few moments, but first let's tell you what's coming up with Kay from 7. Well, the Work and Pensions Secretary Mel Stride is on for the government this morning, the Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds for Labour. We'll also get the latest on the situation in RAFA with General Lord Richard Dannett. Plus, that Wagatha Christie case is back. We'll be speaking to lawyer Joshua Rosenberg as Rebecca Vardy and Colleen Rooney step back into court. Oh, and remember Jordan Banks, the 9-year-old boy struck by lightning in 2021? Well, we'll be speaking to the man who rode from Pisa to Blackpool on a wooden bike in memory of him. Plus, the former football star Ashley Kane will be on to talk about his 92-day challenge of running, cycling and kayaking the length of the UK. And finally, a lawyer breaks ranks and speaks his mind about the Post Office scandal. Well, that's what's to come from 7, but time for the news review now. Mari's here, also joined by the political commentator Alicia Fitzgerald. Thank you so much for coming in. Plenty of politics. Let's start, shall we, with the front page of the Express.
Yes, so this is another really big story in the Conservative election campaign and a big woo to win over those traditional Conservative voters. We obviously know already that Rishi Sunak has vowed to keep that triple lock with the pensions, and he's now taking that one step further and saying that he will actually unfreeze that personal allowance tax threshold for everyone who is in receipt of the state pensions. Just a reminder about what that all is. In 2021, Rishi Sunak said that he would freeze that personal allowance at the 2021 level. That's just over £12,500. And he has now said that for pensioners, he will unfreeze that on the same terms as the triple lock. So that's 2.5% inflation or average earnings. So another really big boost for the pensioners trying to really secure those votes.
Being dubbed Triple Lock Plus, which sounds like a TV catch-up channel. You know, they're kind of like plus one. It's they kind of give me those kind of vibes. Quadruple lock, as I said earlier, which I quite like.
Yeah.
But this is going to be a big vote winner for people who are of pensionable age.
Yeah.
But for the vast majority, you know, the younger generations, for example, they're not going to be moved by this, surely.
Well, I mean, some would argue you might be moved by it because one day you will become a pensioner and therefore you might want to vote for that. The difficulty is, I mean, the kind of questions that ministers are going to realistically be asked over the next few weeks is going to be, well, why not unfreeze that threshold for everybody? Why only pensioners? So you have working people who will continue to have what they call that stealth tax.
Favourite
topic.
How
I love to talk about stealth
Favourite
taxes by the freezing of those thresholds, but then pensioners will be exempt. Now their argument will be we've got a lot of pensioner poverty and therefore we have to protect pensioners, and it will be nothing to do with the fact that older people vote more and therefore they are, it's going to be a vote winner realistically, which is what they need in an election like this. But nonetheless, it is difficult when you have a situation where realistically you feel more and more, especially with national service now, that there may potentially be more of a swaying toward the older vote and there is less and less reason to vote Tory if you're a younger person.
Remind me of your stat about over 70-year-olds?
Yeah, there's the most recent YouGov poll actually says that people over 70 are now the only age group more likely to vote for the Conservatives than the Labour Party. So you can definitely imagine that Rishi Sunak and Conservative HQ will have drawn on that data and said, right, what is the last thing that we can do to really secure those votes for any of those pensioners who are still undecided?
Front page of the Daily Mail is interesting because we had Bridget Phillipson, the Shadow Education Secretary, on the programme yesterday, who said effectively that she didn't recognise forecasts that would warn that their plan to scrap VAT or impose VAT on private schools would thus mean that private schools would close and there'd be this deluge, potentially, to lack of a better word, of kids now moving into the state sector. Well, the Daily Mail is painting the opposite picture to what she was saying.
Well, exactly. So, I mean, as you say, she literally yesterday on the record told you, I don't recognise that characterisation, I don't think it's going to happen, it's not going to be a problem. Now this report that the Daily Mail is splashing with is all basically saying, actually it looks like potentially it might be worse than Labour expected. So they're talking about potentially as many as 224,000 private school pupils could be forced into the state sector because of this VAT exemption that would be abolished under the Labour Party. So they're saying that's almost half of all fee-paying pupils. And essentially, the thing that's really important here is if this were to happen, now this is only a report, it's a projection, we don't really know for sure what would happen, so we have to take this with a pinch of salt. But what they're trying to argue is, number one, it will drive up costs for the taxpayer, because if you have more people in state education instead of private, then that becomes a burden on the taxpayer. But second of all, what they're saying is this could end up making very good state schools even more competitive. And we do know that even though they are state schools, realistically, a lot of the time it is wealthier people who end up sending their children to the best state schools because they can afford houses in the catchment area and so on and so forth. So the concern, what the Daily Mail, is trying to say is the concern is how will this actually affect the state sector and therefore potentially the least well-off pupils. That's the argument.
Thoughts?
Well, again, this was always the problem with this policy, and the trouble as well is that this particular way to generate revenue for the Labour Party is doing a lot of heavy lifting with lots of their other announcements, and this is one of their two key ways, that and closing that non-dom tax loophole to fund so many of their pledges so far. So if this one isn't going so well, that does then put some of their other policies into question. If this doesn't maybe generate as much revenue as they were hoping, what is their plan B? What's their backup? And I'm sure Keir Starmer will be asked a lot about that in the coming weeks.
I think also, the Labour Party would argue these numbers are going to be inflated. We are not going to see this kind of thing. People who are going to, public schools, they will find a way. We will make sure that they find a way. I'm sure they will come back with a lot of things on this. So, I do want to be fair to them, but nonetheless, it is a legitimate concern.
Talking about kids, actually, leads us quite nicely onto the TikTok election, which reminds me of that transition that Rishi Sunak did at that time. If you're from Skegness, you're going to want to hear this, and then it's still the hand comes and bring it back. We'll skip over that. But it is fair to say, isn't it? This is a social media election more and more and more every year.
It really is, and I think that perhaps the craziest thing about this in particular is the use of TikTok specifically. Obviously, there are different social media platforms they could be using, but there's been this massive drive on TikTok. Why is that significant? Because just last year, Oliver Dowden made that speech in the Commons and said that he was banning TikTok in Parliament. You can't even open the app on Parliament Wi-Fi anymore. That's how strict it is within Westminster. So the fact that now, come the election, we've seen both leaders of two of the main parties, plus the other parties as well, really trying to use this platform to win over younger voters. It's really quite interesting.
Government Minister, I think Grant Shapps has a TikTok, for example, and has to have kind of a non-government burner phone, effectively, to have the app on it.
Letting it all his secrets out, exposing it.
Yes, I remember when they banned TikTok, Grant Shapps did a TikTok saying, it was kind of like a meme, a clip from The Wolf of Wall Street, saying, I'm not going anywhere, basically, because he loves TikTok so much and he loves his own TikTok content.
But am I right in thinking you're not allowed to actively campaign on TikTok? There's kind of a nuance there, isn't there? So they can kind of post videos, etc., but they can't do kind of political advertising per se.
Well, I'm not sure how well that's going for them. It seems pretty political to me so far. I mean, I think so far the Labour Party's TikToks seem to be going down a bit better. I think you can very much tell there's someone pretty young on their social media team who's very queued up with what the latest TikTok trends are, because they're all very much on trend.
Well, Labour's content is a lot more funny than the Tories' content, but they do have to be careful, because if they only appeal to young people, we do know that young people don't vote as much, and so they could fall into a trap where they could end up being really popular with young people in theory, like we saw even with Jeremy Corbyn. He was on stage at Glastonbury, remember? But nonetheless, you could end up, appealing to the people who end up not actually voting.
Well, that, and also you could argue that Labour already appealed to young people generally as well. So obviously yesterday we very much saw Keir Starmer trying to tap into voters that he didn't already appeal to. Whereas with this, it's kind of like, if young people generally are more likely to vote Labour, is this a worthwhile use of your time?
I think, though, as we've seen in previous elections, you can't take any part of the electorate for granted, can you? So they would argue, well, it is worth our time, because we've seen kind of silent Tories, for example. We've seen not enough young people coming out and actually voting for Labour. Just very quickly, the front page of the Times, Mary, if you will.
Yeah, so this is very quickly interesting. Warning of civil unrest over new EU border rules. So essentially, we've got new rules. If you're entering into the EU and you're not an EU passport holder, you're going to have to give your fingerprint and a photograph. And essentially, what they're saying is the French, and also here in the UK, Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron, are quite concerned about that. And actually, the French are concerned about disruption to public order, saying they couldn't rule that out. Now, we know that the French are more revolutionary than us in the UK, for instance. That's their history nonetheless. But at the same time, they've got talking about how Lord Cameron said he's really worried about long delays for travellers going from the ferry from Dover, but also the Eurostar as well. So people need to watch out for their summer holidays if there ends up being some tricky.
Cues to come. I'm afraid I've got 15 in my ear, so thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it. There's plenty more papers to get through. We've got all the front pages on the Sky News website and on the Sky News app. Mara and I are going nowhere. Kay is coming up from 7 with all the day's top stories. Do stay with us.